Hello, my sleepy heads. It's good to have you back on History for Sleep. In the following minutes, you will experience a deep state of relaxation. This story helps you to easily sleep through the night, so you can get up energized in the morning. Not only will you fall asleep faster, you will also get rid of disturbing thoughts. Listen to these history stories for at least 10 days for the best results. The longer you listen the video, the more likely you'll experience persistent and positive changes in the way you sleep. I wish you a great rest, and if you haven't already, we'd be very happy if you consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss any new calming and relaxing history story. Tonight, we're going to slowly journey into the world of medieval Ireland, a land of misty green hills, stone castles, and simple cottages, where survival was a daily struggle and the balance between faith, labor, and fear shaped every moment of life. Over the next couple of hours, we'll imagine what a single day might have been like for the ordinary people of this land. Their food, their work, their beliefs, and the constant challenges that shadowed their lives. So settle in, let the weight of today drift away, and together we'll step softly into a past both harsh and unforgettable. Before you get comfortable and let your mind drift into this ancient world, I'd love it if you could take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if these calm stories of the past bring you peace. Your support truly helps me grow and keep making these calm journey through time just for you. And in the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so wonderful to see our little community listening together from all corners of the world, quietly sharing these stories across space and time. So, settle in, take a slow breath, and let us step softly into the land of the Nile, where each sunrise and sunset tells a story of life, survival, and human resilience. Now let's begin. Imagine for a moment that you open your eyes not in your own bed, but inside a humble thatched cottage in medieval Ireland. The first thing you would notice is the cold. Not the gentle coolness of modern air conditioning, but a deep, damp chill that seeps into your bones. The cottage walls are built of wattle and daub, woven sticks coated in clay, which do little to keep out the wind and rain of the Irish climate. The roof above you is thatched with reeds, thick enough to shed water, but not thick enough to block the draft. You are lying on a rough straw mattress, spread loosely over a wooden frame, perhaps with an old animal skin pulled over you for warmth. The smell around you is a mixture of smoke from the fire, the dampness of earth, and the closeness of livestock. For in these cottages, animals often shared the same roof as humans. A cow or a pig might be just a few feet away, separated only by a low wooden partition, their warm breath mixing with yours in the confined air. Morning does not arrive gently here. There is no alarm clock, but the sound of animals stirring is enough to pull you from uneasy rest. The cow shifts on its feet, the chickens rustle in the corner, and a dog perhaps scratches at the packed earth floor. You rise in near darkness, for windows are rare, and if there is one at all, it is no more than a tiny hole covered with an oiled cloth. The only light comes from the faint gray of dawn slipping through the cracks of the door and the smoldering embers of last night's fire. Smoke lingers in the air because the cottage has no chimney. Instead, the fire sits on a simple hearthstone in the center of the room, and the smoke has to find its way out through the thatch above. This smoke stings your eyes and clings to your clothes, but without it, the fire would die, and warmth and cooking would be impossible. In medieval Ireland, a smoky home was a living home, and waking up in the haze of it was as natural as breathing. As you stretch yourself upright, your body immediately feels the discomfort of the night. There is no soft mattress, no pillow filled with feathers. Instead, you have slept with a rolled piece of cloth beneath your head, or perhaps nothing at all. The straw beneath you is uneven, itchy, and often crawling with small insects. If it has been some weeks since it was replaced, it carries the stale smell of mold and sweat. Your blanket, if you have one, is woven from rough wool, scratchy against the skin and never truly warm enough to hold back the Irish damp. You notice the aches in your back, the stiffness in your legs, and realize that this is the ordinary condition of waking up here. A good night's rest is not measured in comfort, but in the simple fact of having slept at all. For many peasants, sleep was broken by hunger, by the cold, or by the noise of animals. Yet there was no choice. The day demanded labor, and even if you were not well rested, you rose because survival depended on it. Around you, the rest of your family is beginning to stir. A medieval Irish household is rarely a private one. Privacy, as we know it today, simply did not exist. The cottage is one single room, and here live parents, children, perhaps a grandparent or two, and sometimes even servants or extended kin. Altogether, they rise from their straw pallets, rubbing tired eyes, scratching at fleas, and wrapping themselves in coarse woolen garments that never seem to fully dry. The air is filled with the sound of coughing, the shuffle of bare feet on the earth floor, and the faint murmur of prayer as someone whispers a morning blessing. The smell of humanity is strong, mingled with the smell of livestock. A pig grunts impatiently, a calf lets out a sharp cry, and chickens peck at the ground, eager for scraps. For a visitor from the modern world, the closeness of this life would be overwhelming. There is no space to be alone, no chance to wake slowly in silence. In medieval Ireland, to live was to share, and to share was to survive. The first true task of the morning is tending the fire. Without it, the day cannot begin. Someone reaches into the hearth, blowing softly on the embers, coaxing them back to life. Bits of dried turf, cut from the bog and stacked for the winter, are placed carefully on the fading coals until the flames leap up once more. The smell of burning turf fills the cottage, earthy and thick, clinging to hair and skin. This fire is the heart of the home. It warms the family, it cooks their food, it dries their damp clothing, and it wards off the dark. To let it go out is a serious mistake, for starting a new one would mean hours of difficulty with flint and tinder. As the fire strengthens, a dim glow spreads through the room, throwing flickering shadows on the walls, illuminating the tired faces gathered around it. You huddle close, pulling your rough cloak tighter around your shoulders, feeling how the warmth never quite chases away the chill. This is the medieval morning ritual. No coffee, no tea, just the fragile gift of fire. Breakfast, if it can be called that, is simple and unchanging. There is no bread fresh from the oven, no fruit, no sweet taste to soften the morning. Instead, a pot is set over the fire, filled with water and a handful of oats. Soon it becomes a thin porridge, sometimes thickened with buttermilk if the household is lucky enough to have it. The children eat first, dipping wooden spoons into the steaming pot, while the adults wait their turn. For many, this is the only meal until midday, and it must carry them through hours of labor in the fields or at the loom. The taste is plain, sometimes sour, but there is little choice. Food is fuel, and every scrap counts. A small piece of cheese might appear, hard and sharp, saved carefully from the last market day. Perhaps a crust of stale bread, if the household can afford wheat at all. To a modern visitor, this meager meal would feel inadequate, but to a medieval Irish family, it is the rhythm of survival, as ordinary as the rising of the sun. As you eat, you notice how the cold never leaves. The cottage is a fragile defense against Ireland's wet winds. Rain often seeps through the thatch, dripping slowly into corners where puddles form. The floor beneath you is packed earth, uneven and damp, worn smooth by countless footsteps. Rats sometimes scurry along the edges, bold enough to snatch crumbs when no one is looking. The walls are rough, patched in places where the clay has fallen away, letting drafts sneak through. You pull your cloak tighter, but the chill bites regardless. This is not a home built for comfort, but for necessity. It is quick to build, cheap to repair, and good enough to hold life within its walls. Yet for someone used to modern insulation, heating, and the steady hum of electricity, the cottage feels more like a shelter than a home. The harshness of this environment is something you cannot escape. It surrounds you at every moment, reminding you that in medieval Ireland, survival was never certain, and even the simplest morning was a battle against discomfort. When the fire has been strengthened, the animals tended, and the children fed, the family prepares to step out into the day. The door is nothing more than a wooden plank, sometimes hung loosely, sometimes simply pulled into place at night. When it is opened, the gray light of dawn floods in, and the damp air rushes over you. Outside, the ground is muddy, the fields stretch in every direction, and the sound of crows carries on the wind. Life awaits, long hours of labor, little rest, constant uncertainty. But before you step outside, you realize something important. This first hour in a medieval Irish cottage has already tested you in ways that modern life rarely does. You have woken in discomfort, shivered in the cold, eaten food that does not satisfy, and breathed air thick with smoke. To survive a single morning here requires toughness, resilience, and acceptance of hardship. For anyone from the modern world, this first step into medieval Ireland is already proof enough. You would not last long. Stepping out of the smoky cottage into the pale morning air of medieval Ireland, you are greeted by a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. The rolling fields are cloaked in mist, the ground soft and wet beneath your bare feet or rough leather sandals. Dew clings to the tall grass, soaking your woolen cloak almost immediately. There is no comfort in this freshness, for the dampness never leaves. As you walk, your coarse wool tunic scratches against your skin. It was hand-spun, dyed with simple plant colors, and cut in a shape that is more practical than pleasing. Beneath it, perhaps a linen shift, if your household can afford such a luxury. But linen is rare, and most make do with the itch of wool directly against the flesh. Your legs are bare or covered with rough wool leggings tied with cord, your feet encased in shoes made of rawhide, stiff and often damp. Clothing here is never truly clean, never truly warm, and always heavy with the scent of labor. To a modern sleeper in soft cotton sheets and synthetic fleece, this morning dressing feels like stepping into a world of constant discomfort. The morning meal has already been eaten, and though it was meager, it must carry you through the long hours ahead. Now comes the work that defines the day. For the majority of medieval Irish families, survival depends on agriculture. The fields must be tended, and this labor begins before the sun has fully risen. You might be sent to fetch water from a nearby stream or well, carrying it in a heavy wooden bucket that pulls at your arms with every step. Water is not just for drinking, but for cooking, for animals, and for the family's small daily needs. Each trip is long and tiring, and there is no alternative, no pump, no tap, no ready supply beyond what your body can carry. At the same time, children might be tasked with gathering firewood, dry sticks, and brush collected from the hedgerows. In Ireland's wet climate, truly dry wood is rare, and much of what you gather smolders more than it burns. Yet this is what keeps the hearth alive. The entire morning is consumed with these simplest of tasks, which are as vital to survival as eating itself. As the adults turn toward the fields, the scale of their work becomes clear. Medieval Irish agriculture relies on simple tools: wooden plows pulled by oxen, handheld hoes and sickles, little more than sharpened iron bound to wood. To work the land here is to bend your back against the soil, often waterlogged from Ireland's endless rains. Oats and barley are the primary crops, for wheat grows poorly in the damp, and potatoes, the crop that would later define Ireland, have not yet arrived from the New World. This means the diet is monotonous and harvests are fragile. A poor season can mean hunger for an entire village. And so, every morning, every able body must contribute to the work. Men guide the oxen, women and older children scatter seeds or weed the furrows, while the youngest gather stones from the soil to make the land more usable. There is no end to this work, no day when it is not required. The fields rule life here, demanding attention from sunrise to sunset. To a modern listener, such unbroken, physical labor before the day has even begun properly would be an unbearable burden. Meanwhile, inside the cottage, other chores continue. Women prepare wool for spinning, parting it carefully to remove burrs and dirt. The sound of combing fills the dim room as fibers are drawn straight, ready for the drop spindle or loom. Spinning is slow, methodical work, yet it is essential. Every garment, every blanket must be made by hand, and the task never ends. Beside this, some tend to the animals. Chickens must be fed scraps or grains, their eggs carefully collected. Pigs root noisily near the door, eager for any refuse. Cows are milked, their warm milk filling a wooden pail, some to drink fresh, most to sour into buttermilk or be churned into butter. These tasks are not optional. To neglect them is to weaken the household's survival. The rhythm of chores is endless, and the weight of responsibility falls on everyone, regardless of age. Even a child of 5 has duties: gathering eggs, herding goats, or carrying small bundles of wood. In this world, childhood is not an age of play, but of contribution. To imagine modern children in such roles is to realize how far removed comfort and ease have made us. The clothing worn for these tasks is never truly suited for comfort. Rough wool absorbs water quickly, clinging heavily when soaked. Dyes made from plants and roots fade swiftly, leaving garments dull and brownish. Clothes are patched and repatched until the fabric is more stitched than cloth. Shoes, if owned at all, are crude constructions of hide tied with leather cords, their soles thin and quick to wear through. In winter, when winds whip across the land and snow falls over the bogs, people wrap themselves in heavy cloaks pinned at the shoulder, sometimes lined with sheepskin if they are fortunate. Yet still, the dampness creeps in, chilling to the bone. Washing clothes is rare, for soap is costly and rivers are cold. Dirt and smoke cling permanently, the smell of labor embedded in every fiber. To dress in medieval Ireland is to arm oneself not with fashion or elegance, but with layers of necessity, garments that serve only to shield, never to comfort. A modern listener, used to soft fabrics and warm laundries, would find such attire unbearably harsh, every thread a reminder of survival's cost. As the morning stretches on, more tasks emerge. Perhaps you are sent to the fields not to sow or plow, but to collect rushes. These tall plants, growing in wet ground, are gathered, dried, and later strewn on the cottage floor to cover the damp earth. They are also dipped in animal fat to serve as rushlights, a poor man's candle, burning briefly and unevenly. Another chore might be cutting turf from the bog, stacking the heavy, wet blocks to dry in the sun for future fuel. This work is grueling, your hands blistering on the wooden spade, your back aching as you carry the weight. Yet it is necessary. Without turf, the fire dies. Without rushes, the cottage floor turns to mud. Every small duty is tied directly to survival. There are no luxuries, no wasted efforts. Each movement of the hand, each ounce of strength must serve a purpose. For the modern person, accustomed to machines, convenience, and ready supplies, the sheer constancy of these chores would be exhausting long before the day has reached its true beginning. Even the simplest needs are struggles. Fetching clean water is not always guaranteed. Rivers are muddy, and wells may run dry. To drink is to risk illness, yet there is no alternative. Cooking utensils are few: clay pots, wooden bowls, iron cauldrons if fortune allows. Meals must be stirred constantly over the fire, the smoke stinging eyes, the heat burning hands. Bread, if baked, is coarse and heavy, ground from oats on a corn stone, a laborious process that takes hours. The act of preparing food is itself a form of work, demanding constant attention, constant effort. Unlike modern kitchens, where abundance and convenience reign, here every crumb matters. To waste food is to flirt with hunger. Each bite is hard-earned, each sip a reminder of fragility. The morning is shaped by these battles for the simplest sustenance, a constant reminder that in medieval Ireland, survival begins not with comfort, but with endurance. By the time the sun climbs higher in the sky, hours of labor have already passed. The morning has been consumed by tending fire, clothing the body, milking cows, fetching water, spinning wool, cutting turf, and preparing fields. You feel the weight of fatigue already pressing down, your body aching, your stomach unsatisfied. Yet the day has scarcely begun. For those who lived in medieval Ireland, this was not extraordinary. It was ordinary, expected, unchanging. Each dawn brought the same cycle of discomfort, toil, and endurance. There was no choice, no escape, only the rhythm of necessity. To a modern traveler, dropped into this world, these morning struggles would be overwhelming. The absence of comfort, the weight of responsibility, and the endless repetition would drain body and spirit alike. Before even reaching midday, one thing would become clear. In the cottages and fields of medieval Ireland, you would not survive long. As the morning stretches into day, the heart of life in medieval Ireland reveals itself in the fields. Agriculture is not just an occupation. It is survival itself, binding every man, woman, and child to the soil. The land here is fertile in places, but unpredictable, shaped by rain-soaked bogs, rocky outcrops, and uneven pastures. A modern visitor might look at the rolling green hills and see beauty, but for those who lived here, the sight was both a promise and a burden. Every patch of ground had to be fought for, cleared of stones, tilled by hand, or coaxed into yielding grain. There are no machines, no iron plows pulled by teams of horses, just wooden frames, crude iron blades, and oxen that move at a slow, weary pace. The air is filled with the sounds of grunting animals, scraping tools, and voices calling across the fields. Work here is not glamorous or romantic. It is muddy, exhausting, and relentless. The weight of survival presses down as surely as the clouds above. Each seed dropped into the earth carries with it a silent prayer that it will grow and that the family will endure another winter. The main crops are oats and barley, for they endure the damp Irish climate better than wheat. These grains become the staple food of the peasantry, ground into coarse bread or boiled into porridge. There is no variety, no rich table spread with options, only what the soil can provide. Rye and peas are also grown, though sparingly, and beans when the land allows. Vegetables are limited. Onions, leeks, and cabbages, hardy plants that can withstand the cold. Potatoes, so closely tied to Ireland in the modern imagination, are still centuries away from arriving. Without them, the diet is fragile, vulnerable to the smallest shift in weather. A wet summer may rot the grain, a harsh frost may kill the seedlings, and too much rain can turn the soil into a swamp of useless mud. In such times, hunger becomes an unwelcome but familiar companion. For the medieval farmer, there is no guarantee that today's backbreaking work will yield tomorrow's meal. Each swing of the hoe, each furrow dug, is a battle not against laziness, but against nature itself. And nature, in this damp and windswept land, is rarely kind. Farming is a communal effort, bound by the ties of kinship and necessity. The family works together, but neighbors too may share labor, especially during the great turning points of the year, planting and harvest. In spring, the seeds must go into the ground quickly before the weather turns. In autumn, the grain must be cut, bound, and stored before the rains ruin it. Failure to act swiftly can mean ruin. Men swing sickles and scythes, their arms aching from repetition, while women and children gather the cut stalks into sheaves. The bundles are carried to small storage huts or piled in thatched ricks, where they wait to be threshed and ground. Every step is heavy with effort, each movement part of an endless cycle. Unlike modern life, where food arrives in abundance from far-off places, here the community depends solely on what they themselves can pull from the earth. There is no safety net, no import of grain from other lands. If the harvest fails, the people suffer together. And so, each hand, no matter how small, finds a role in this demanding choreography of survival. The tools of farming are simple, and their simplicity makes the work harder still. A wooden plow, shod with a thin strip of iron, scratches shallowly at the soil. Oxen strain against the harness, their pace slow, their breaths labored. A man walks behind, guiding the plow, his feet sinking into the mud with each step. Weeding is done by hand, the farmer stooping low, pulling stubborn plants from the earth. Harvesting requires bending and cutting for hours at a time, the sharp sickle biting into the stalks. Hands blister, backs ache, shoulders stiffen. There are no gloves, no boots with thick soles. No relief beyond the brief pauses to drink or wipe sweat from the brow. Even threshing, the separation of grain from stalk, is done with wooden flails, swung again and again against the pile, until the kernels scatter free. Dust fills the air, choking lungs, stinging eyes. To a modern worker, used to machines and tools designed for efficiency, the sheer weight of this labor would feel insurmountable. Yet in medieval Ireland, it was simply life, repeated year after year without end. The rhythm of the seasons governs everything. Spring brings planting, summer demands endless weeding and tending. Autumn is consumed by harvest, and winter is a season of both rest and fear. For while the fields lie fallow in the cold months, the people live on what they have managed to store. If the harvest was poor, the winter becomes a season of hunger, when meals shrink and stomachs growl. In good years, the grain bins hold enough to see the family through until the next spring. In bad years, people resort to desperation, boiling weeds, stretching the stores with bark or acorns, or simply doing without. The fields, then, are not just a workplace, but a lifeline. They dictate the health of every man, woman, and child, holding the power to nourish or starve. A modern listener, drifting into this story from the comfort of a stocked kitchen, might struggle to imagine a world where every meal depended on the uncertain generosity of the soil. But for those in medieval Ireland, this was the inescapable truth of life, pressing down with every sunrise and every turn of the seasons. Animals, too, are bound to the rhythm of farming. Cattle are among the most prized possessions, not only for milk, but as symbols of wealth and status. Pigs root noisily in the fields and forests, eating scraps and acorns, growing fat for slaughter. Chickens scratch at the ground. Their eggs are rare and welcome addition to the diet. Sheep provide wool, their bleating a constant sound across the hills. These animals are essential, yet caring for them is another endless task. Cows must be milked twice a day, their dung cleared, their feeding ensured. Pigs escape their pens if not watched carefully. Sheep wander if left untended. Wolves still roam the wild places of Ireland, and thieves are never far. To lose livestock is to lose survival itself. And so, farming in medieval Ireland is never just about crops. It is about balance, about managing fields and animals together, keeping the fragile household afloat. For the modern ear, lulled by the quiet hum of machines, the sheer attention demanded by this daily care would be overwhelming. Here, the farm is not a choice, but the anchor of existence itself. What makes the weight of farming truly unbearable for an outsider is not just its difficulty, but its constancy. There is no day when the fields can be forgotten, no morning when the animals can be left alone. Holidays and feast days may offer a brief respite, but even then, the essential tasks cannot be neglected. Fires must be kept alive, animals must be fed, water must be fetched. The land is a jealous master, always demanding, never satisfied. In this world, laziness is not simply frowned upon. It is dangerous, risking hunger and punishment alike. The social fabric itself is tied to farming. Rents and tributes are paid not in coins, but in grain, butter, and livestock. The Lord's demands weigh as heavily as the soil itself, and the peasant bears both burdens at once. To a modern traveler, one day in these fields would be exhausting enough. But for those in medieval Ireland, this was not a day's trial. It was the entirety of life, stretching forward endlessly, year after year. As evening approaches, the fields finally grow quiet, but the weight of survival does not lift. Families return to their cottages with weary bodies, their clothes damp with sweat and rain, their hands roughened by tools. They gather around the fire to share a simple meal, porridge, perhaps bread, maybe a little milk or cheese. Conversation is low, for exhaustion presses down. Yet beneath the weariness lies a constant worry. Was enough work done today? Will the seeds grow? Will the harvest come? The fields may rest in darkness, but the mind does not. For the medieval farmer, sleep itself is shaped by the land, dreams haunted by weather and crops, by fear of hunger and the hope of plenty. To imagine yourself here, lying down after such a day, is to feel the immense weight of survival pressing upon every breath. It is here, more than anywhere, that the truth becomes clear. In the fields of medieval Ireland, a modern soul would not last long. As the long day of labor unfolds, one force weaves itself quietly yet powerfully through the lives of people in medieval Ireland: faith. To survive in such an unforgiving world, where hunger, disease, and violence press in at every corner, belief is not a luxury, but a necessity. The church bell tolls in the distance, its sound carrying across mist-covered fields, summoning both rich and poor to prayer. Within small stone chapels, lit only by flickering candles, men and women kneel on cold flagstones, whispering Latin prayers they may not fully understand. The priest's voice fills the silence, reminding them that their suffering on earth is but a passage, that the reward awaits beyond. For the weary farmer, the exhausted mother, the hungry child, such promises bring a fragile comfort. Life here is hard, often brutal, but faith transforms suffering into meaning. To a modern listener, accustomed to explanations of science and medicine, such reliance on ritual might feel strange. Yet for the people of medieval Ireland, faith is as essential as bread, something that carries them through each grueling day. Religion permeates every moment, woven into the rhythm of daily life. The rising sun calls for a prayer, meals begin with blessings, and the setting of the day ends with a whispered plea for protection in the darkness. Feast days punctuate the calendar, moments of joy amid the weight of toil. Yet these holy days are not simply occasions for celebration. They are obligations. To miss Mass, to neglect confession, to ignore the demands of the Church, is to risk not only social shame, but eternal damnation. The priest holds immense authority, guiding not only spiritual lives, but also the practical rhythms of the community. He may bless the fields before planting, sprinkle holy water over cottages to guard against illness, and remind his flock to pay their tithes faithfully. Faith is not separate from survival, it is stitched into it. The Church offers structure, order, and a promise that beneath the chaos of storms and sickness lies a divine plan. For those who lived in constant uncertainty, such certainty was a balm. Without it, despair might have consumed them entirely. But Christianity, though dominant, did not erase the older beliefs of Ireland. Beneath the surface of Catholic ritual lingered echoes of a pagan past. Sacred wells were visited, not only to honor saints, but also to appease older spirits tied to the land. Stones marked with crosses might once have been places of druidic worship, repurposed but never forgotten. In the deep forests, stories persisted of fairies, the Sea, who dwelled in the mounds and glens. Families left offerings of milk or bread at certain spots, not out of devotion to God, but out of fear of these unseen forces. Children were warned not to wander near fairy forts or disturb certain ancient trees, lest they invite misfortune. Such superstitions ran parallel to Christian faith, existing not in conflict, but in uneasy harmony. A medieval Irishman might attend Mass in the morning and leave a token for the fairies by nightfall, hedging his bets against all possible powers. For him, the world was filled with both divine grace and hidden dangers, both of which had to be respected to survive. Rituals of protection were constant companions. To keep sickness away, herbs were hung in doorways, charms were tied to the wrist, and holy relics, tiny bones or fragments of cloth, were treasured as shields against evil. When a child fell ill, prayers were said to saints known for healing, but mothers also whispered old incantations taught by their grandmothers. A sick cow might be blessed with holy water one day and circled with fire the next. To modern eyes, these acts may seem contradictory, but for the people of medieval Ireland, they were part of the same worldview, a fragile balance of faith and superstition, where every action, no matter how small, carried weight. To fail to say the right prayer, to forget to leave an offering, to neglect the guidance of the priest, any of these could invite misfortune. And so, life became a careful weaving of rituals, binding the seen and unseen together. Survival was not only a matter of food and labor, but also of maintaining the favor of forces both heavenly and earthly. The great cycles of the year reinforced this mingling of belief. Festivals such as Samhain, Beltane, and Lughnasadh, once rooted in pagan tradition, were reinterpreted within Christian frameworks but never fully lost their older meanings. At Samhain, the end of harvest, people believed that the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Families lit great fires to ward off wandering spirits, while also offering prayers for the souls in purgatory. Beltane brought bonfires of protection for cattle, the smoke drifting over the herds as blessings against sickness. Lughnasadh celebrated the first fruits of harvest, thanking both God and the land itself for their bounty. To live in medieval Ireland was to dwell in a world where faith and superstition coexisted seamlessly, each reinforcing the other. Rituals gave order to chaos, transforming fear into action. For the weary peasant, standing before a roaring fire beneath the vast Irish sky, the blending of these beliefs was not a contradiction but a lifeline, an assurance that, however uncertain tomorrow might be, they were not powerless. In moments of crisis, this reliance on belief grew even stronger. Famine, plague, or raids drove people deeper into ritual. Entire villages might process together, led by a priest carrying relics, chanting prayers to ward off disaster. Holy wells were visited in times of drought, their waters believed to hold miraculous power. Pilgrimages became acts of devotion and desperation, journeys to sacred sites where healing or forgiveness might be found. Yet alongside these holy acts, the old fears crept in. A failed harvest might be blamed on the fairies, or on a curse spoken by an enemy. A child's sickness could be seen as punishment for neglecting a ritual. These explanations, while fearful, offered a form of understanding. In a world where survival hung by a thread, the unseen forces gave shape to suffering. For the people of medieval Ireland, it was better to believe that misfortune had a cause, even a supernatural one, than to accept it as meaningless. Faith and superstition, together, created a map of meaning in a world otherwise too harsh to endure. At night, as darkness settled across the land, prayers became even more urgent. The Irish countryside was thick with shadow, its silence broken only by the wind or the distant howl of wolves. Without the glow of lamps or the safety of walls, fear crept easily into the mind. Families gathered around the hearth, reciting prayers to protect their homes from fire, theft, or spirits. Mothers traced the sign of the cross on their children's foreheads before bed, whispering blessings into the smoky air. Some placed iron near the doorway, believing it repelled fairies, while others sprinkled holy water over the threshold. Sleep was fragile, haunted by the knowledge that danger could come from man, beast, or spirit. To survive the night was not taken for granted. It was something prayed for, hoped for, safeguarded by ritual. For a modern listener, lulled by the safety of electric lights and locked doors, such fear might seem distant. But in medieval Ireland, faith and superstition were the very walls of protection, unseen but deeply felt. By dawn, as the sun returned and the fields called once more, the people rose with renewed dependence on these unseen powers. Their faith was not an abstract theology, but a living, breathing necessity. It shaped how they planted and harvested, how they cared for the sick, how they understood storms and misfortune. Without it, the weight of survival might have been too great. For the medieval Irish, belief offered not certainty of comfort, but the courage to endure discomfort. It was a shield against despair, a thread of hope woven through the fabric of hardship. And so, every day, they moved between prayer and superstition, between church and sacred well, between the blessings of the priest and the whispers to the fairies. To live in this world was to believe, for without belief, there was nothing left but the cold, relentless reality of survival. For us today, to step into their shoes, even for a moment, is to realize how fragile our own endurance might be. In medieval Ireland, without faith, you would not last a single day. To live in medieval Ireland was to live within a web of loyalties and obligations, where every man and woman belonged to a clan, and every clan was bound by blood, land, and the authority of its leaders. Unlike the centralized monarchies that grew elsewhere in Europe, Ireland remained a land of shifting powers. Chieftains, lords, and petty kings, each ruling over their own people, each jealously guarding their lands. For the common farmer or herdsman, life was not guided by personal freedom, but by service to the clan. The chieftain was both protector and master, demanding tribute, loyalty, and labor. His authority was unquestioned, woven into law and tradition, upheld by warriors who enforced his will. To stand outside this system was to stand exposed, without protection, a dangerous prospect in a land rife with feuds and raids. For those accustomed to the independence of modern life, this world would feel suffocating. You were not your own. Your life, your family, your harvest, all were bound to the will of lords and clan leaders whose decisions could make or unmake your survival. Power in this world was displayed not through palaces or riches, but through cattle. To own cattle was to own wealth, to command respect, to feed families and followers alike. A lord measured his strength by the size of his herds, and by the warriors he could support through them. Tribute was paid not in coins, but in butter, grain, or livestock, handed over by the peasants who worked the fields and tended the animals. A poor family, struggling to survive, might see their best cow taken as tax, leaving them with nothing but hunger. Yet to resist was unthinkable for the Lord's men. Hardened fighters loyal to his command would enforce his demands with little mercy. The law of the clan was not a gentle law. It was a system that preserved order through fear as much as through loyalty. For the commoner, each interaction with the Lord's authority was a reminder of their low station, their fragile place beneath the weight of hierarchy. The clan itself was a source of both security and danger. To belong to a kin group meant protection in times of need, but it also meant obligations that could not be refused. When feuds erupted between neighboring clans, the men were called to arms, whether they wished to fight or not. A farmer could be taken from his field and thrust into a skirmish, his spear in hand, his body exposed to sudden violence. Women and children bore the consequences as villages were burned, cattle stolen, and fields destroyed in retaliation. The cycle of feud and vengeance seemed endless, each generation carrying forward the grudges of the last. In such a world, peace was fragile, a thin veil stretched across the ever-present thread of conflict. To a modern listener, accustomed to law courts and governments that settle disputes, this ceaseless rhythm of feud would feel unbearable. For the medieval Irish, however, it was simply life, a world where might and loyalty determined survival more than justice or fairness ever could. Laws existed, but they were not laws as we understand them today. The Brehon laws, ancient and intricate, govern matters of inheritance, marriage, and compensation. Yet justice was not blind, nor was it equal. The power of a man's clan often determined the outcome of disputes. Fines were paid in cattle or goods, and those too poor to pay might see their land seized or their freedom lost. Women had some rights in these laws, more than in other parts of Europe, but they too were bound by the authority of their kin and lord. A peasant could appeal to custom, to tradition, to the authority of a Brehon judge, but ultimately the strong prevailed. For those at the bottom of this hierarchy, the law was less a shield and more a reminder of their weakness. Injustice was not rare, it was expected, endured, and passed down through generations. To step into such a world from our own would feel like entering a place where fairness itself had been reshaped, where survival depended not on truth but on power. The chieftain's hall stood as the center of this power. It was not a castle of stone in the early medieval centuries, but a great timber hall, its roof thatched, its walls strong yet simple. Inside, warriors feasted on meat and ale, the chieftain at the head of the gathering, his presence commanding loyalty. Bards sang songs of his victories, reinforcing his right to rule, while guests and allies shared in the food that symbolized his wealth. For the common people, such gatherings were distant, yet their effects were felt in every demand, every levy, every command passed down through the ranks. The hall was the beating heart of the clan, but it drew its lifeblood from the toil of those in the fields. Without their labor, there would be no feasts, no warriors, no displays of might. And so the commoner lived in the shadow of the hall, bound to sustain a system that consumed their strength, often leaving them with little for themselves. Violence was never far from this world. Raids were common, both between Irish clans and from outsiders. Viking longships, though less frequent by the later Middle Ages, still haunted memory. Their sudden attacks burned into stories and songs. Norman lords too began to carve their place into Irish soil, bringing with them new weapons, new castles, and new demands. For the peasant, these shifts in power brought little comfort. Whether under the rule of a Gaelic chieftain or a Norman lord, the weight of obligation remained. Fields could be trampled, homes destroyed, and lives lost at the whim of greater powers. To live here was to live with the knowledge that your fate was never your own. A modern visitor might feel crushed beneath the unpredictability of it all, the sense that no matter how hard you worked, survival could be undone by a raid, a feud, or the will of the Lord. It was a life lived on borrowed time, each day a gamble against forces beyond your control. Yet, within this harsh system, loyalty was fiercely valued. To betray your clan was to lose everything: protection, land, even life itself. Honor was currency, and reputation shaped the destiny of families. Stories of loyalty and betrayal were passed down in song and tale, reminding all of the rewards of faithfulness and the dangers of treachery. Hospitality, too, was sacred. To turn away a guest was to invite shame, while to protect them brought honor. These values stitched together the harsh fabric of clan life, giving it meaning beyond fear. But still, beneath the poetry and ritual, the weight of rule pressed hardest on those who had the least. The peasant bore the burdens so that the lords could maintain their power, their halls, and their wars. To live in this system required endurance, submission, and acceptance of a hierarchy that left little room for choice. For a modern soul, accustomed to speaking freely, choosing freely, and living under the idea of equality, this world would feel like a cage, tight, unyielding, and inescapable. As night fell over medieval Ireland, the authority of the lords and clans did not fade with the sun. Warriors still kept watch, guarding cattle from thieves, patrolling the boundaries of the clan's lands. The weight of obligation pressed on even in dreams, as families whispered prayers for protection from raids and misfortune. The commoner lay down on straw bedding, knowing that tomorrow would bring more labor, more tribute, more demands from the world above them. For the chieftains, power was glory. For the peasants, it was burden. To imagine stepping into this system, even for a single day, is to feel the suffocating lack of freedom, the endless weight of rule pressing on your back. In medieval Ireland, survival was not only about food and labor. It was about bending to the will of the lords and clans, accepting a place in a hierarchy that offered little kindness. Without such submission, you would not last long. For in this land of shifting power, the harsh rule of clans was as inescapable as the rain, and just as relentless. Life in medieval Ireland was always overshadowed by the possibility of conflict. For the common farmer or herdsman, war was not some distant tale. It was a constant thread, woven into the rhythm of everyday existence. The boundaries of clans were never fixed, but shifting and contested, marked by streams, forests, and hills that could change hands through raids and feuds. A man might rise at dawn to tend his cattle, only to hear shouts at the horizon, signaling that raiders were near. Fires could spread through fields in moments, and the security of yesterday could be undone before midday. For those living in this fragile world, peace was never trusted. It was seen instead as a pause between storms. For a modern visitor, used to order and the predictability of law, the constant fear of sudden violence would be unbearable, a reminder that survival was as fragile as a candle flame flickering in the night wind. Clans feuded with one another over grazing rights, stolen cattle, or old insults passed down through generations. A slight given by one chieftain might spark retaliation, and before long, entire communities were drawn into cycles of bloodshed. These conflicts were often small, violent bursts rather than great battles, yet their effects were devastating. Fields might be burned, leaving families with nothing to harvest. Livestock could be stolen, robbing a clan of both food and wealth. Children grew up hearing stories of raids not as legends, but as memories, for nearly every family bore scars from the feuds of the past. Women and men alike carried this fear, knowing that their homes could become battlegrounds at any time. To survive, one needed loyalty to their clan, the courage to endure loss, and the acceptance that violence was simply part of life's fabric. For an outsider, the endless cycle of vengeance would feel suffocating, impossible to comprehend in a world that craves stability and peace. The fear of external raiders made this reality even harsher. Though the great Viking Age had passed, the memory of longships cutting across the waters lingered in Irish imagination. For centuries, coastal towns and monasteries had been ravaged by Norse warriors, their arrival swift and brutal. Villagers whispered tales of flames rising against the night sky, of churches looted, of captives dragged away into slavery. Even in later centuries, when the Viking threat had lessened, Their legacy remained in fortified settlements and the mistrust of the sea. Then came the Normans, armored knights from across the Channel, who brought not fleeting raids but conquest and occupation. Their castles rose from the earth like stone giants, reminders that Ireland was not safe from the ambitions of foreign lords. For peasants, these shifts in power meant little comfort. Whether raided by Vikings or taxed by Norman barons, the outcome was the same: hunger, loss, and the gnawing fear that no home was secure. Weapons in this world were crude but deadly. Spears and axes were the most common tools of war, easy to craft and easy to wield. Warriors carried round shields of wood and leather, painted with simple designs that marked their clan. For the peasants, these weapons were not abstract. They were objects they might be forced to hold themselves. When the chieftain called, even men with no skill in fighting could be summoned to defend the clan's cattle or fields. To be handed a spear and told to stand in line against raiders was not a choice, but an obligation. The terror of hearing war cries echo through the hills, of feeling the weight of a weapon unfit for one's hands, would be overwhelming for someone used to peace. And unlike the stories of knights in glory, these fights were messy, chaotic, brutal affairs, leaving bodies strewn across muddy fields and families grieving without end. Survival in such a world meant living under the shadow of war, never certain when you might be pulled into its grasp. For those who lived in villages, the signs of conflict were everywhere. Cattle enclosures were reinforced with wooden stakes, homes kept close together for defense. Fires were carefully tended, for a torch in the wrong hands could reduce a thatched roof to ashes in moments. Mothers taught children to stay silent at night, to hide if strangers approached. Men kept watch over the fields, not only for wolves, but for raiders creeping through the darkness. Every household knew the drills of escape: where to run, where to hide, what to carry if the warning cries were raised. For a modern person, the constant preparation for violence would feel exhausting, a weight too heavy to bear. But for the medieval Irish peasant, it was a necessity of life, as natural as planting crops or tending sheep. Fear was not a visitor here. It was a companion, always close, always whispering of danger. The destruction left behind by violence was often worse than the fighting itself. Fields blackened by fire, granaries emptied, cattle driven away. These were the scars that lingered long after the raiders had gone. Hunger followed war like a shadow, for without grain or livestock, entire communities faced famine. Disease too spread easily in the wake of conflict, as wounded men brought infections home and displaced families crowded together in unhealthy conditions. To lose a battle was not only to lose warriors, but to risk the survival of an entire clan. And so, even those who never raised a weapon still bore the cost of war. The weight of suffering fell hardest on the poorest, who had no stores to fall back upon, no reserves of wealth to rebuild. For them, each conflict was a wound that might never heal, another step deeper into hardship. To live in this cycle was to endure repeated blows, always uncertain whether the next raid would finally undo all you had struggled to hold together. At night, the fear of violence grew stronger. Darkness in medieval Ireland was deep, with little to break it beyond a flickering hearth or a candle stub. In that silence, every sound carried weight. The howl of a wolf, the creak of branches, the distant echo of voices on the wind. Families lay awake, wondering if the noises outside were only nature or men moving through the shadows with torches in hand. A raid at night could come without warning, leaving no time for escape. The mere thought of it filled sleep with dread, turning rest into something fragile and uneasy. For a modern listener, accustomed to locking doors and trusting in the safety of police or neighbors, such vulnerability would be unthinkable. But for the medieval Irish, it was simply part of life. To live in constant awareness that peace was never certain, that safety was always temporary, and that nightfall might bring more than dreams. In this harsh landscape of feud and raid, survival depended on community. Alone, no family could stand against violence. Together, bound by clan ties and loyalty, there was at least the hope of endurance. Men fought, women endured, children learned early that fear was as natural as hunger. Violence was not an occasional tragedy but a rhythm, pulsing through the centuries, shaping the lives of those who lived and died under its shadow. To step into this world, even for a single day, would be to feel the tension in every moment. The sense that danger was just beyond the hills, waiting, watching, ready to strike. For a modern visitor, this fear would consume the mind, leaving no space for rest or peace. But for the people of medieval Ireland, it was the air they breathed, the soil they walked, the constant reminder that life itself was fragile and survival was never guaranteed. Food in medieval Ireland was more than nourishment. It was survival itself, measured in grain stored, cattle counted, and butter churned. To the modern visitor, accustomed to markets overflowing with endless variety, the reality of a medieval Irish village would feel stark and narrow. Diets were simple, built around oats, barley, and dairy, with meat reserved for rare occasions. Bread was coarse, porridge was daily, and ale was safer than water. A family might rise to a breakfast of oat cakes or gruel, eaten quickly before the day's labor began. Hunger lingered constantly, for meals were never assured. A poor harvest, a raid, or a harsh winter could strip a village of its stores, leaving people to scrape by on whatever they could gather. The fear of running out was always near, a companion at every table. To a modern listener, the monotony of this diet and the uncertainty of its supply would feel unbearable. But for the medieval Irish, it was simply life, lean, fragile, and never guaranteed. Oats were the backbone of survival. From them came porridge, oat cakes, and even a kind of bread, filling if not always pleasant. Barley, too, was common, used for both bread and ale, its bitterness a reminder of necessity rather than choice. Potatoes, now central to the image of Ireland, were unknown in these centuries. They would not arrive until the 16th century. Instead, roots like turnips, wild greens, and leeks flavored the daily meals when available. Dairy offered some relief. Milk, butter, and cheese were valued staples, though they were far from plentiful in every home. Cattle were precious symbols of wealth, and rarely slaughtered for meat unless for feasts or sacrifices. For the common peasant, meat was not a daily indulgence, but a rare gift, remembered long after it was eaten. To step into this diet would feel like stepping into scarcity, where every bite was measured and every meal a calculation of what might be left for tomorrow. Hunger was not a rare visitor, it was a constant threat. The medieval year was marked by what some later called the hungry months, the lean period in spring when winter stores ran low and new crops had yet to grow. During these months, families stretched meals thin, mixing grains with wild herbs, boiling nettles or sorrel, anything to keep the stomach quiet. Children cried with emptiness, their parents helpless against the rhythm of nature. A poor harvest only deepened this suffering, leaving villages desperate. Some turned to acorns, ground into bitter meal, or fish caught in streams and rivers if luck allowed. But not all had access to such resources. In these times, weakness set in, making people vulnerable to sickness, their bodies too frail to fight. For a modern person, the idea of such constant insecurity around food is almost unimaginable, for hunger today is often distant, occasional. In medieval Ireland, it was never far away. It was a shadow that followed every family, year after year. Yet within this scarcity, there were moments of abundance, moments that shone brightly against the gray canvas of daily life, the feasts. When cattle were slaughtered, when harvests were gathered, or when a lord called his people together, tables filled in a way that seemed almost miraculous. Meat roasted over open fires, great cauldrons of stew bubbled with herbs and barley, and butter was spread thick on fresh bread. Ale flowed, and the air filled with music and song. These occasions were rare, but they bound communities together, offering a glimpse of joy in an otherwise harsh existence. For peasants, the memory of a feast could sustain them through leaner days, reminding them that life, though difficult, still had moments of celebration. For a modern visitor, such a feast might seem modest compared to today's banquets. Yet for the medieval Irish it was overwhelming, a reminder that abundance, however fleeting, was possible and worth cherishing. The contrast between feast and famine was stark. One week, families might share roasted lamb, honeyed cakes, and strong ale under the watchful eye of their lord. The next, they might huddle in smoke-filled cottages, eating little more than thin porridge, their stomachs aching with emptiness. This rhythm of plenty and want shaped the psychology of medieval life, instilling both gratitude and fear. To waste food was unthinkable. To share it, an act of survival as much as kindness. In these villages, meals were communal, eaten not in solitude but in the presence of family, neighbors, and kin. Hunger, when endured together, became less crushing. Feasts, when shared, became richer in meaning. But still, the uncertainty never disappeared. The people knew that what was enjoyed today could vanish tomorrow, leaving them again at the mercy of fields, weather, and fate. For those used to full cupboards and daily choice, this uncertainty would be an unbearable strain, gnawing at both body and mind. The role of the Lord in this cycle of hunger and feasting was significant. Chieftains and nobles held the power to command cattle, to organize gatherings, and to redistribute food. At times, this role offered protection, as lords ensured their people survived lean seasons by sharing from their stores. At other times, it deepened hardship, for tribute and taxes stripped peasants of their best produce, leaving them with little for themselves. Loyalty was tied to food. Those who obeyed might be fed, while those who resisted faced hunger. For the poor, their relationship to food was always bound up in power, shaped by forces beyond their control. A modern visitor, used to independence in choosing meals, would struggle to imagine such dependence, where the whim of a lord could mean the difference between nourishment and starvation. But for the medieval Irish peasant, this was reality. Food was never only about farming. It was about hierarchy, obligation, and survival within a world that gave little mercy. Food also carried deep symbolic meaning. Cattle, as the source of milk and butter, were more than wealth. They were life itself. Butter was treasured, sometimes buried in bogs to preserve it, later unearthed as if drawn from nature's vault. Ale, too, was more than drink. It was community in liquid form, consumed in gatherings that marked both joy and sorrow. Even the simplest meal carried weight, for it was the measure of a family's survival. Rituals often accompanied meals, prayers whispered before eating, gratitude given even for thin porridge. In this way, food was tied to faith, to the belief that each mouthful came by divine grace. To the modern listener, accustomed to abundance and choice, it might be difficult to grasp how sacred each meal could feel. But in medieval Ireland, food was never taken for granted. It was a gift, fragile and fleeting, and hunger was always waiting just beyond the door. As night fell, families gathered around the hearth, sharing what little they had, their shadows dancing against the smoky walls. The day's labor ended in this quiet ritual of eating, whether in plenty or in want. Children ate first, elders next, and if anything remained, the parents took their share. The fire crackled, the sounds of chewing and low voices mingling with the wind outside. For some, the meal was filling. For others, it was thin and unsatisfying. Yet the act of gathering, of eating together, gave comfort, even when hunger lingered. To imagine oneself here, after a single day of labor, with only a bowl of porridge and a crust of bread, is to understand why survival was so difficult. A modern body, used to abundance, would weaken quickly. A modern spirit, used to certainty, would falter under the constant threat of hunger. In medieval Ireland, food was not only survival, it was struggle, ritual, and hope. Without it, you would not last a day. When the sun dipped behind the low hills of medieval Ireland, the world was swallowed by a darkness deeper than most of us today can imagine. There were no streetlights, no glowing windows, no reassuring hum of electricity. Night descended like a heavy curtain, wrapping villages and cottages in silence and uncertainty. The faint glow of hearth fires gave the only comfort, their smoke curling up into the chill evening air. For families huddled inside their thatched homes, the fall of night was not a gentle pause, but a reminder of their fragility. The day's work might be done, but the dangers of the world were far from asleep. To the modern listener, used to the safety of locked doors and softly lit neighborhoods, this medieval night would feel overwhelming, oppressive, and unrelenting in its shadows. Inside the cottage, the air was thick with smoke and the warmth of the fire. Children lay on straw bedding, wrapped in rough woolen blankets, while parents whispered quiet prayers. Outside, the sounds of the night carried far, the rustle of wind through the trees, the distant cry of an owl, or the unsettling howls of wolves that prowled the edges of fields. Wolves were not merely stories in these centuries. They were real threats, capable of snatching livestock or even attacking those caught outside after dark. Every sound beyond the cottage walls became a source of fear, for it could mean raiders, thieves, or worse. Sleep did not come easily. It was a fragile state, broken often by the need to listen, to remain alert to danger. The darkness pressed close, and the line between safety and peril was as thin as the cottage wall. Travel at night was rare, and for good reason. Roads were little more than dirt tracks, winding through forests, bogs, and open fields. Without the light of the moon, a traveler could lose their way within minutes, stumbling into marshland or crossing into the territory of an enemy clan. Bandits, too, waited in the shadows, ready to strike the unwary. To step outside the safety of your village after sunset was to gamble with your life. Even those who lived near neighbors stayed close to home, for trust ended with the fall of night. A simple errand, a missing animal, a delayed return from the fields, could spiral into terror if darkness caught you unprepared. For someone today, used to cars, maps, and lit highways, the thought of being stranded in such a world of shadows would be unbearable. The medieval night was not a time for movement. It was a time for endurance, for holding still until dawn's light returned. Fear of the night was not only practical, but spiritual. Medieval Ireland was a land where faith and superstition intertwined. Stories of fairies, spirits, and wandering souls filled the imagination. Sacred wells and lonely trees were avoided after dark, believed to be places where the other world pressed close to the mortal realm. Children were warned not to wander, lest they be taken by unseen hands. Candles were lit not just for light, but for protection, their flames warding off evil. The Catholic faith too played its part. Families crossed themselves before sleep, asking saints for protection through the long hours of the night. Dreams themselves carried weight, seen as messages or omens, reminders that even in rest the spirit was vulnerable. For a modern visitor, used to dismissing shadows as empty, the medieval night would feel alive with unseen presences, heavy with the weight of belief and impossible to endure without fear. Within the cottage, sleep was shared. Families, often with animals brought inside for warmth, lay close together, their bodies pressed against one another for comfort. The fire was tended carefully, for its glow was more than heat. It was a guardian against the darkness. A dying fire meant vulnerability, both to the cold and to the things that might creep in with the night. Smoke hung low under the thatched roof, making every breath heavy, but it was endured, for the alternative, dark, silent cold, was worse. Parents listened for noises outside, while children shifted restlessly, caught between hunger and fear. Privacy was non-existent, but comfort came in numbers. To be alone at night was the greatest danger of all, for solitude invited despair. In this shared closeness, families found a fragile defense against the weight of night, a reminder that survival was always a collective act. Yet even in this closeness, dread lingered. Raiders often struck at night, slipping through the dark to steal cattle or burn cottages. Villages knew this, and so the night was never trusted. A sudden barking of dogs, the faint glow of torches on the horizon, or the sound of hurried footsteps could throw an entire household into panic. Men grabbed spears, women gathered children, and all prepared to flee into the woods if needed. The thought of waking to fire and violence haunted every family. For a modern person, secure in the expectation of peace during sleep, the idea of living each night with such fear would be unthinkable. In medieval Ireland, however, it was reality. To close your eyes was to take a risk, and each new dawn was a victory in itself. But night was not only fear. It also carried moments of quiet beauty. The sky, unpolluted by modern light, stretched vast and clear, filled with stars so bright they seemed almost close enough to touch. The Milky Way arched across the heavens, a silent river of light guiding travelers and dreamers alike. Families who dared step outside might whisper at its sight, struck by its vastness. The moon's silver glow painted the fields and forests, turning the familiar into something otherworldly. Songs and stories often drew from these sights, weaving the heavens into the rhythm of life. For the weary peasant, this beauty was bittersweet, a reminder of both the wonder and the fragility of existence. To look up at such a sky was to feel small, vulnerable, yet part of something larger than the fear of the night. For the modern listener, this glimpse of beauty might seem magical, yet the fear that came with it would still be too much to bear. As dawn finally broke, relief spread through the village. The pale light revealed what had survived the night. The cattle still in their enclosures, the cottages unburned, the children still asleep on their straw beds. Another day had been won, another battle against the darkness endured. Yet the memory of the night lingered, etched into every sigh of relief, every glance toward the horizon. For the medieval Irish, this cycle repeated endlessly. Fear at sunset, endurance through darkness, gratitude at dawn. To step into such a world, even for a single night, would be to feel the weight of a fear so constant, so pressing, that rest itself was nearly impossible. The modern body might endure the cold, the smoke, even the hunger, but the modern mind, accustomed to safety and light, would crumble under the dread of such nights. In medieval Ireland, survival was not just a matter of food or labor. It was a victory over the shadows themselves. Without such strength, you would not last a day. And so, our journey through medieval Ireland comes to an end. We've walked through dawn and labor, faith and fear, and we've braved the long hours of darkness. Life in that world was fragile, uncertain, and filled with challenges that few of us today could endure. As you drift deeper into rest, let the echoes of their lives fade softly into the night. Thank you for joining me in this quiet exploration of the past. Sleep well, and may the shadows of history bring you peace, not fear. Good night.